Kia ora mai tātou, nau mai whakatau mai ki tēnei kōrero, ko Marine Protection in Aotearoa te kaupapa o te wā. Ka nui te mihi ki tēnei kaupapa ki a koutou hoki. And now I'll ask Harry Burkhart to give us a karakia for starters. Harry.
Kia ora tātou. Kei nui tātou. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina te hiuta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi aki ana te atakura, e tio, e hoka, e hauhu, ti hei mauriora.
Kia ora, Harry. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this discussion. Today, we will be talking about how we can achieve marine protection in Aotearoa, and we ask people to be respectful of our kaupapa and to each other. Thank you so much for joining us today for our 8th session of Changing Tides, Tai Tōrua, the web series that takes a deep look at the issues that affect our moana, the ocean. Thank you for joining us today. Tai Tōrua is brought to you by WWF-New Zealand and Te Papa Atawhai, the Department of Conservation. And thank you to those organisations for making this series possible, and also to the team behind the scenes. I'm your host, Elisabeth Easther, and with 5 panellists today, I vote we get straight down to business and make the most of this 75-minute session. Throughout the course of this webinar series, we heard calls for faster and more effective marine protection in our waters. But we also heard that there is a need to address some of the issues that typically slow down or delay protection of our underwater environment. Ideally, we need to find out how we can address these issues and what needs to change to be able to be more effective in the processes that facilitate protection of our precious marine environment. So today's webinar, People's Choice, and the topic is, as voted by you, protecting our marine environment in Aotearoa. What are the challenges, issues, and opportunities? But before I introduce our speakers, a small handful of housekeeping matters, which those of you who have joined us before will be very familiar with. Chat. A chat window will be open for the next 10 minutes. If you're having technical problems, the behind-the-scenes team will assist you. Q&A. There is a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, a box will pop up and you can type in your question, although questions will be filtered to avoid duplication and any that are off topic will be removed. Bearing in mind we have just 1 hour and 15 minutes, we may not get to answer every question, but you can also email marine@doc.gov.nz. And voting. If a question appears that you wanted to ask, and rather than ask it again, give it the thumbs up and that will move it to the top of the list. And I will endeavour to ask the questions with the most votes first. Recording. This session is being recorded and will be put on YouTube. Today's session will be uploaded tomorrow on the WWF New Zealand channel, where you'll also find all our other sessions. Finally, to reiterate, our kaupapa, our guiding philosophy, it's very simple. Whatever you say today in comments or questions, please be respectful. Kia ora. Now to the exciting stuff. Today we are delighted to have joining us through the magic of Zoom, Moana Tamaariki-Pohe, Dr. Peter Longdill, Peter Burkhart, Professor John Montgomery and Barry Torkington. And we also have Katherine joining us, using her years of relevant experience in this space to help delve into some of these complex issues during the Q&A. And I'll start now by introducing each of our panellists, who'll have 3 to 5 minutes each to introduce themselves and their relationships to the topic. Our first panellist is Harry Burkhart. Harry has served on the board of Ngāti Kuri since 2008. He's now leading his iwi through Te Ara Whānui, or the Many Pathways, a 1,000-year intergenerational plan that focuses on restoring relationships and responsibility to Ranganui and Papatūānuku. Kia ora, Harry.
Kia ora. Well, let me just start off by thanking those who have made this possible for us to have this conversation. And as we walk through today, my task is to frame a conversation that we can actually understand probably the pathology and the psychology of where we're going with a singular problem that's complex and needs significant responses to change paradigms. So just by way of introduction, you'll notice my surname Burkhart is a long Māori name. No, it's not. My father's Swiss and my mother's Māori. What's interesting around my whakapapa is I have line of sight to 40 generations before when the first waka, the Kurahopa, landed in top of the North Island. Then I've also got line of sight to 25 more generations that were part of the kupe sailing with Arua Tamore, who's a ariki of us, and the waka Tai Tōrua. Now, before all of you take your calculator and go 40 by 25 and 25 by 25, whakapapa is a really important way of building connectivity, and particularly connectivity to whenua and moana. So the ways I'd like to kind of frame the conversation is using 3 waypoints, and I'll try not to be provocative on the way through. So the 3 waypoints that I'm thinking about, and you'll all be familiar with these, by the way. So these are not new conversations. So my sense, everybody in the room is in the room because they're looking for a solution or the solutions or be part of the solutions. So let me unpick what I think those 3 waypoints are as a reflection. If people remember Leonardo DiCaprio's movie, The 11th Hour, there were 2 bits at the back of it that just really hit me front and centre. One of them was a comment by Southern Baptist that the things that we were seeing around our global issues was a spiritual malaise. And then the last comment was made by First Nation Indian, who said, when man is not here, the earth will heal itself. And I found those 2 thoughts really compelling because they were speaking to the pathology and the psychology of humankind at a deep level. So then you go back to Rachel Carson, 1962, mother of global environmental movement. So we're all familiar with these stuff. And we understand they're the pathways or the waypoints on these journeys that we're on. I want to take you back to what I think, even though those messages are kind of writings on the wall, let me speak to you what I think the wall is. So when you go back to Māori creation stories around Rangi and Papa Tuanuku, the Western paradigm sees them as allegories. For Māoridom, they're real. And in those stories that define us and refine us, they talk about responsibility, reciprocity, being part of an ecosystem. There's a bit of lexicon that's sneaking in from a new world. And how do we find our place in those relationships? We, from a Māori epistemology, those are real for us because they speak about our connectedness to a spiritual world and a reciprocity around Rangi and Papa Tuanuku. Now, what's interesting about those processes is when we come up hard against science, and I really mean hard against science, is if you accept my view that science is a doctrine and an ideology, fundamentally, when we introduce those things, those paradigms that are important to us, we come hard up against the hegemony. And my sense is until we understand that and acknowledge that, we're not going to be steering these solutions down in a principled and a moral way. So if I can share with you from a Ngāti Kuri perspective what we think the solutions are, there's probably 3 points. One is build understanding, the second one is build understanding, and the third one is build understanding. And what that's code for is the ability for us to share with a Western paradigm the power of our epistemology, how we see the world. And what we've been privileged with is working with the science community up in the top of New Zealand, because it's a hugely unique place, both in the land and in the sea, around letting them know how we see our world and letting them share with us how they see our world. And what joins us is the passion of understanding. So we call that moihotanga, deep understanding. And the deep understanding allows us to have insights beyond, in my view, what a science fraternity and what a science doctrine doesn't bring to the table. Now, we're not scared of science, you know, we're part of that. But what that does, it allows us to create a whole different set of tools to stare down the challenges that are real to all of us. My sense, even how we use lexicon and lexicon to unpick that, case in point is we're all wedded to a concept of marine protected area. We've got a different view of that. We call those concepts puna ora, places to heal, for the ocean to heal itself. That's where rangi and Papa Atawhai bring those relationships together for the betterment of the earth. So there's a sovereignty component that's got to be allowed to connect itself. The second bit of that process is when you use those concepts that are part of us, like dynamic rahui, then you start to get an understanding how you deal with the reality that we're in an environment, and this is not about locking things up and throwing the key away. It's about how do we manage those resources in an appropriate and responsible and a reciprocal way, which is fundamentally our responsibilities using our framework. So on that point, I just want to close with a comment I heard Peter Garrett say a couple of years ago. And he said, the modern zeitgeist is cynical of political processes and disdains its small victories. And what I believe that Māori posit is the zeitgeist is not modern. And yes, I agree with them. Politics will not get us there. So kia ora, everyone.
Kia ora, Harry. I like what you said, and I think building understanding and perhaps circumnavigating politics are really salient. And our second panellist we're hearing from is Dr. Peter Longdill, General Manager Sustainability at Sanford's, one of New Zealand's oldest fishing companies, established by Albert Sanford in 1865 in the Hauraki Gulf. And Peter's not been around quite so long, but he does have 20 years experience in marine environmental science and management here and abroad, including time spent consulting to the UN and various governments here and abroad around aquaculture development. Kia ora, Peter.
Kia ora. Thank you. And I guess I'll start off also by thanking WWF for putting on this series of webinars and also my fellow panelists today. So it's very nice to see you here, and look forward to a conversation later on in the webinar. So my connection, if you like, with the ocean has been a lifelong connection. I developed it in the Bay of Plenty, where I sort of spent my formative years. And the ocean for me has become a place of, recreation and enjoyment is where I really started. There, I've basically tried my hand at each and every ocean-based water sports there is, and I get a lot of enjoyment out of it. That interest, if you like, led me to a lot of studies and my work environment that I'm in now. A lot of my research over the years has focused on the sustainable use of coastal and marine resources, and in particular coastal infrastructure and aquaculture. One real focus area for me has been offshore aquaculture, and it's its potential as a low impact, sustainable food production system. And I'm certainly working on that aspect in my current role as General Manager Sustainability at Sanford. So I guess my personal view, when I stand back and look to the ocean, I see the oceans as a place of nature, a space for recreation, a space for spiritual connections, a space for food gathering and sustenance, a space for commerce, and a space to create livelihoods. It's a real well-being space. Each one of those functions, of course, is very important, and it's a challenge to balance their demands where there are competing uses. And certainly I think that's sort of one topic that we'll traverse today in terms of protection. So in terms of that space in particular, my personal interest in relation to the ocean's potential as a food production system, when I step back and look at the global population, the forecast is for approximately 10 billion people by the year 2050. So we need a food system at a global scale that can provide for those people within planetary boundaries. We don't really have that system at the moment. A lot of the current operating systems, you know, there's side effects and negative consequences that scaling up the existing systems is not suitable. So at a global level, we really need to look to how that can take place, how we can provide nutrition for people in a sustainable way, protecting the things we need to protect, and providing nutrition. That, as I see, the oceans have a huge part to play in terms of potential aquaculture, different species, growth. Obviously, there's limited scope to increase volumes in terms of fisheries, wild harvest. So I think we need to look beyond our traditional land-based systems, more to the oceans and to how we can better use those resources. So that's my brief introduction. Back over to you, Elisabeth.
Kia ora, Peter. I really appreciate you coming because, you know, there is a lot of clash between recreational, commercial and fishing in these discussions. This is where it gets really robust. So we're really grateful to have you here. Thank you. And just quickly before I introduce Moana, we'd like to apologise. We believe some people were struggling to get on with the link, quite a lot of people. So if you know someone who was meant to be here and they're telling you they can't get on, we've put the link onto the social media channels. So welcome to those of you who arrived late. We do apologise. And yes, welcome. And you can catch what you missed on YouTube because this will be loaded on YouTube tomorrow on the WWF channel. So now to welcome Moana Tamaariki-Pohe. Moana is a member of the Ministerial Advisory Committee Sea Change, Tai Timu Taipari and the Marine Spatial Plan, as well as having been the former Deputy Chair of the Hauraki Gulf Forum. Moana is also co-founder and president of the Ōrākei Water Sports Club, an iwi-based community-focused waka organisation, among many other things. Kia ora, Moana.
Kia ora, Elisabeth. Tēnā koutou katoa, and thank you to WWF and Te Papa Atawhai for this amazing opportunity. Kia ora, ko tāmaki makaurau tōku tūranga waiwai, ko Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, Ngaitai, Waiohua ngā iwi, ko Moana Tamaariki-Pohe tōku ingoa. Hi, I'm Moana, true blue, born and bred in Tāmaki Makaurau, otherwise known as Auckland. I was born in Ōrākei and raised in Māngere. I say I have one foot in the Waitemata and one in the Manukau, and I'm from everywhere in between. My passion for and my commitment to the environment, in particular the Waitemata, Hauraki Gulf, came from my father and to him from his father. My father always said, if you love something, you have to take care of it. I love Okahu Bay, I love the Waitemata, and I love the ocean. Across the world, I've swum with whales, stingrays, sharks, and manta rays. I, along with my dad and my sister Donna and a group of friends, started a waka-ama organisation, Orake Water Sports, in 1999. I say organisation because the sport and the rec side is a very small part of what we do. We use our waka as a vehicle to communicate wider issues such as the degradation of our marine environment. I was very fortunate to be involved in the mussel restoration project at Okahu Bay, led by Rochelle Kahui-McConnell and Brendan Dunphy. We're now seeing the benefits. Tasting the benefits will come a little later. Another project I'm really and extremely proud of is the removal of the moorings in Okahu Bay. 2 weeks following the removal of the last mooring and the boat, we were delighted to share the bay with a pod of dolphins. And if anybody knew Okahu Bay prior to that, I think it was a dream that was far out of reach for a lot of people. I was a former member of the Hauraki Golf Forum, including Deputy Chair and Acting Chair, before resigning in February this year. Through the forum, I got to meet and work alongside some amazing people, including the Nuruita family, who are working hard to get some form of marine protection around the Noises Islands and the Hauraki Gulf. I'm currently a member of the Ministerial Advisory Committee for Sea Change, Tai Tōrua, alongside some amazing other members. My expertise is 50 years plus lived experience, mātauranga Māori, Māori knowledge that has been handed down through the generations. I've seen the decline in the health of our environment, and I'm committed to being a part of the solution. I'd love to encourage and empower the everyday person to come and get their butts wet and make a difference. Martin Luther King said, if you can't do great things, do small things in a great way. We can all do small things in a great way. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa.
Put a little lump in my throat. Thank you. I utterly agree. Yes, we can do, all of us, small things that will turn to great things. That's so true. Kia ora. So kia ora now to Barry Torkington. Barry is an advisor to both the New Zealand Sport Fishing Council and Legacy, with a background in commercial fishing and aquaculture. Chair of the New Zealand Fisheries Symposium in 2016, Barry has also served as Director of Lee Fisheries and has been deeply involved in many aspects of New Zealand fisheries for over 30 years. Barry.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And again, thank you to those who have put this forum together. It's my first time involved in one of these, so we're all learning as we go, I guess. Look, I come to this from quite a long journey, not far from where I'm sitting right now, which is on the shores of the Whangatei Harbour. My father was a commercial fisherman, as was his father before the war. I didn't ever meet my grandfather. He died when I was very young. So I grew up in amongst the shellfish and the fish and the scales and the wounds and the highs and lows of fishing. And I have my earliest memories are of sort of the 50s, the late 50s, as a child, with my father and his brother crayfishing out of here, and they were the first ones that began crayfishing, so I had some strong memories of those, and then fishing myself in the 60s on. So I've had a lifelong interest in the ocean and in fisheries in particular. I have no particular qualifications except 70 years of experience and curiosity and a willingness to investigate, be inquisitive. So the first point I'd like to make is that we're stuck in a little bit of a bind as we're seeking marine protection. And we're seeking marine protection, and the call for it is becoming more and more strident and wider. And it seems to me, anyway, that this driving force, this voice is getting louder and louder as the general conditions of our nearshore fisheries decline. So the worse state of nature becomes as people experience it, the more they look for solutions. The one solution that is getting more and more acceptance is marine protection. And I can understand that. I can see that. But I think in some ways it's misguided in that just as important or more important than marine protection is marine conservation in general. And that you must have governance and management settings in place that are able to both conserve and protect and keep their nearshore ecosystems thriving and the food chain intact, and keep all of those natural systems and functions operating, or marine protection on its own becomes a little bit of a short-term gain. And we kind of saw a little bit of that at Goat Island, where a lot of the initial gains and restoration, there was a blip as the surrounding state of the fisheries declined. It also eventually affected the conditions inside the reserve as well. I mean, not to the same extent, but they weren't divorced from one another. And I think that my view is that we should look much wider. We should look at all the fisheries, all the space, all the inshore space, and figure out management and governance settings to restore all of that to an abundant and diverse nature. And so we're not so driven to find these little areas that we want to set up as MPAs as sort of a defence against all the other sins that are occurring out there. So that's the first point. I think that marine protection without effective governance and management is risky, very risky. And the other thing is, the second point I'd like to make is that with most of Western capitalism now, that we're trapped in this sort of short-term view, whereby what's most important is what happens next year. And if we can get a benefit for next year, even if it's at a long-term cost, we'll tend to take it. And Western society is becoming more and more structured, where your rewards are for short-term, for delivering short-term benefits. That's what you're rewarded for, even if there is a long-term cost to what you're doing. And it's becoming more and more and more sort of ingrained and accepted. And it's sort of known as short-termism. And I think we've got to be careful that we don't fall into that same trap where we see marine protection and small areas locked up as a short-term gain, but it's not the long game. It's not going to deliver us the benefits in the long game. So that would be my two sort of opening bids, and back to you, Elisabeth.
Who hasn't done a Zoom seminar before, to have come up with that beautiful picture in the back of the Faroe Islands and the salmon farm behind you and the traditional Scottish vessel. I'm very impressed, because I actually still don't know how to do my own tiles at home. And also, I did want to say that one of the things that we're talking about here, marine protection, is little areas, yes, that would be not as useful as giant areas. And I know that 30% is what's being recommended. So I still feel quite strongly that 30% little areas, no, big areas, yes. And now we're going to ask our final panelist to introduce himself, Professor John Montgomery. John is on the Ministerial Advisory Committee to Sea Change Tai Timu Taipari Marine Spatial Plan, where he uses his expertise around fish sensory ecology, both freshwater and marine. In 1989, John was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand, and he's held numerous leadership and governance positions, including Director at NIWA and Director of the Institute of Marine Science at the Auckland University of Auckland. Kia ora, John.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings to everybody, to my fellow panelists, the audience, and to our hosts. Thank you. So just to give you a little bit of background in terms of my own connection to the marine environment, I grew up in Tamaki Makaurau in Auckland, on the North Shore. I've always kind of been on the beach or offshore in one form or another. And I think the schools that I was at looked out over the Hauraki Gulf, and I can still kind of recall as a primary school kind of looking out over there, and just that's where I wanted to be, essentially. I felt in prison at school. I wanted to be out of there and out on the ocean. So I should have become a mariner, but instead I stuck it out. I was kind of heading down an engineering track, had a 20-minute conversation on Castor Bay Beach with John Morton, who was the professor of zoology at Auckland at that time. He flicked me over into the biology track, which I currently took, but you'll see there's still a bit of an engineering gene in me in terms of where my science has gone. So I went to Otago University and then did a PhD at the Marine Laboratory in Plymouth in the UK, came back to a job in Auckland, and then got quite involved in the Antarctic program, which was a fantastic opportunity to spend kind of most of 20 years, at least in the early part of the summers, down in Antarctica, looking at a kind of completely, I know green fields is the wrong metaphor, but ecosystem down there that hadn't effectively been studied, and try to understand the basics of that. My kind of research from there is, and partly inspired by the Antarctic situation and looking at the way in which the fish were able to survive Antarctic winters, was looking at sensory systems, and particularly non-visual sensory systems, and trying to get a sense of how animals sense their world, which is obviously totally different from what mammals and what we do. And there's a really extraordinary range of non-visual sensory systems in fish in general. So the mechanosensory systems that detect very fine water movement, the electrosensory system in sharks. And one of the things that we've studied extensively over that period is how sharks actually process their sensory information to distinguish between what's happening in the environment that they need to know about and what's happening as a consequence of their own movements and their own activities. And that kind of takes me back to my kind of engineering side. I guess one of the main themes in what I've done is really interested in complex systems and the way in which modelling can capture what we know and what we don't know about those systems. And I think it's fair to say that my research kind of history hasn't been in the area of marine protection. It's been more in that, but I've become a real advocate of the modelling side of things. And I guess one of the waypoints, if you like, for me was I was asked to give the opening talk at an international meeting in Oslo on globalization of the oceans. And my task was to look at the last 30 years in marine science and look at the progress that was made. And what struck me most was that in the physical side of things, there's just been enormous progress. And if you like, and it relates to climate change, the reasons that we are looking at climate change now in the way that we are is that we have the models that predict how the future looks like. And when I compared that with the biology side of things, the biology was still kind of really primitive. We're still in the business of kind of counting species and looking at that. So adding the biology into the system is really complex, but that's where I would like to see things go, and we are making progress in that direction. And I think if we can have predictive models, that it does kind of resonate a bit with what Harry was saying, but probably coming at it from a very different point of view. Understanding would be my go-to as well. And for me, that represents understanding complex systems in a way that we can actually make predictions, that we can understand if we're making interventions, what the consequences of those are and could and would be. So in terms of linking what I've done and my interests and my experience into marine protection, I retired from the university, at least mostly, a couple of years ago. And things have kind of broadened out for me. I've been working as the science advisor for the GIFT Foundation, which is part of Foundation North, looking at restoring the Māori of the Hauraki Gulf. And that's kind of made me think much more widely about some of the local issues and what the potential interventions are. And then, like Moana, I've been part of the Ministerial Advisory Committee, which is implementing the sea change plan for the Hauraki Gulf. And again, that has kind of really opened up my kind of spectrum on what the issues are and perhaps what the solutions might be. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
The old muty thing. Sorry about that. Kia ora, John. That was great. And now we are getting to the Q&A, the panel discussion. So you will notice at the bottom of your screen, we have a little Q&A icon. That is where you can add your questions. And if you like the question that somebody else has already written, thumbs up will help lift it to the top of the list. And joining us for the Q&A is Katherine Short. Katherine has worked in the marine space here and abroad for close to 2 decades. And as well as being a partner in Te Moana, an organisation that seeks to find sustainable solutions to marine protection issues, Katherine is also a WWF-New Zealand board director in training. So welcome, Katherine. And to make life simple in this Zoom environment, I will be addressing questions as posed by the audience to individual panelists. But if panelists are keen to answer a specific question or want to add something to someone else's answer, we're using very old school classroom etiquette, the raised hand. So that's how we will be communicating as we're all in different rooms. And also, Katherine as well, when you want to, make your points, if you can also raise your hand and I will come to you. So just to start with a question for Moana, based on what you have observed in your local marine area, in terms of degradation and depletion, what do you see as some of the solutions to turn things around?
I think really one of the things that we've really concentrated on is getting that engagement with the wider community as well, and addressing the hearts and minds of people. And that's what made the mussel restoration project at Okahu so successful, is the number of people that were engaged, interested, and therefore had a vested interest in the success of the program. I like to think of Okahu as being kind of a little petri dish that we've done this experiment in, that then demonstrates that we can go from bay to bay to bay, and my wish is that everybody experiences a pot of dolphins in their little bay.
Kia ora, Moana. And Barry, how well designed are our policy settings, to your way of thinking, in terms of underpinning effective management to ensure a resilient and productive ocean in Aotearoa?
Oh, big question. I don't think they're particularly well set at all. There's a number of statutes which all overlap in the marine space and all try to deal with the issues of marine management. And they don't fit together particularly well. They tend to clash. And we end up with the latest one which is the regional councils being asked to intervene in the territorial sea in terms of marine biodiversity. So it's a very messy and space legislatively, and for policy, the thing with policy is that there's never a silver bullet. Policy isn't that you go from A to B and everything's fine. It's not a set and forget. Policy is about making a difference, about shifting, making something better. And that better can always be improved upon later on. So it's policy development, a series of steps. So I don't feel persuaded to wait until all the answers are in and all the questions are solved. I think policy settings can be moved to make things better. And for me, that's good enough. But we don't sort of have a very good framework at the moment for allowing that to happen, either through the RMA, the Fisheries Act, the Marine Reserves Act, or the Wildlife Act, or any of them. None of them fit together particularly well.
Is there a reason for that? I mean, when you are approaching government organisations, what does seem to be the result of a meeting?
I think that a lot of it's historical. A lot of these pieces of legislation are old. Technology is developing very quickly, and to jump off John's shoulder, the modelling, the ability of the capability of modelling natural systems is improving rapidly. And all of these sort of tools and understandings are available now that would allow policy settings to change incrementally, to improve, to make things better. But we're trapped in a lot of 30 and 40-year-old legislation in which that was never anticipated. And they require huge amounts of effort to move anything within these old statutes.
And yet the will seems to be completely there on, in so many quarters. And now, actually, I'm going to go back to Moana now, because we've had a lovely question come in about the Māori of the Hauraki Gulf. And my silly thingy is not moving the question up. So we are asking, how do you measure the Māori, particularly, and this is particularly asked about the Hauriki Gulf, but what are the metrics used to kind of understand change?
How do you measure? Really, it is about when we used to talk about Okahu Bay, we would say it didn't feel good, it didn't taste good, it didn't smell good, it didn't feel good to be there. And I'm happy to say that the Māori of that bay is much different now than it was 2 years ago. It's a felt experience. You know when something's not right, and that really is about the measure of the Māori. If you're in an area, the Nuroita family out in the Noises, they've seen the degradation of that area over the years. I was there 1 year and went back over a period of time, but 4 years later could see the difference. One of them being there were no longer scallops there. So, you know, there are visual indicators and other, as John says, sensory indicators to suggest whether the health of an environment is good or not, or has Māori or not.
Kia ora. And also I apologise for that question answer. I was trying to remember what it had been and the computer wasn't moving up to it. So and one of the other things that the person did ask, now I can see the bottom of the question, was about the cultural health index.
A cultural health index. I remember one of the reports that were written a number of years ago by Rochelle. A cultural health index was how many bums in the air can we count collecting kai moana. And, you know, I can count on my nose how many people I see collecting shellfish around the bays in Tamaki Makaurau. So to one day be able to go out there and see, like I did my grandparents, with all bums in the air and their kete, they're collecting kai moana, that would be a cultural indicator, I would say.
I like that. We shall look for bums. Counting bums. And now a question for Harry. Harry, we know you've done a lot of thinking around marine protection. How do you think we can do things differently? And what sort of outcomes do you think your solutions might achieve? Big question.
Yeah. So in terms of our responses to our challenges from a Ngāti Kuri perspective is we've always seen the land and sea as contiguous. So we don't have the natural divisions that maybe you're thinking through your lens. And then we know what well-being looks like is when there's abundance, and the ability for one of the practices we do in our rohi is we always collect kai moana for our kaumata kuia, because not only is it kai, but it's got a Māori in it. And so we're looking for how do we amplify abundance. And the current paradigm is to lock up big chunks of the ocean to reflect that approach. And Chile's done it around Rapa Nui, Papahānaumoku, 1 million square kilometres is another reflection of that. As a concept, we think that's totally appropriate. And then how might you in that context ensure that you're feeding your communities well? So that's out of the abundance conversation. And then the juxtaposition of that is how do we talk to, say, the Packhorse Cray fraternity about not fishing in our areas during breeding, or how do we keep the commercial interests out while the snapper at Pāringaringa are in breeding mode. So those are conversations, they're tools to build abundance. Our concern is fundamentally they become transactional tools as opposed to fully understanding that until Papa Mother Earth is restored its sovereignty and we reciprocate to her first, these conversations will be transactional and they won't be sustainable.
Kia ora. Harry. Also, if I could please ask for Ravi to come in here. I've lost my screen. I have a question now for Peter. In what ways can the commercial seafood sector work to promote inclusive marine environmental protection and sustainable resource use?
Thanks. Look, in terms of what can the commercial seafood sector do, I would say, a number of things. First of all, let's say on the science and research side, obviously promote and fund research into the marine environment. And I'm talking there not only into fish stocks and things, which is already obviously happening to a significant level, but beyond that into the wider ecosystem that supports those fisheries, their spawning behaviour, the nursery areas, and even into these coupal biological and physical models that we heard John talking about earlier, to really try and essentially just enhance and widen understanding around those things, so that protected areas can be planned with a great degree of knowledge. The other sort of things that the commercial sector can do, I think, would be to use the Sustainable Development Goals. So those are 17 global goals that were set down by the United Nations in 2015, crossing across all of society. And in doing so and working towards those goals, it really helps business. It doesn't need to be seafood or fisheries business. It could be any business. Really work towards these long-term transitional changes that really need to be made for society as a whole, and that partly is getting not past, but considering in other non-financial type measures of performance for business as well. So putting a high level of emphasis on those and really including those into decision making. The other thing I think that the sector could do is really promote and embrace innovation, both in terms of operational innovation, on the fisheries side, species type innovation and purpose innovation on the aquaculture side towards regenerative solutions. We've heard about the mussel project in Okahu Bay, and activities like that could be supported and expanded. And I think also really being open to dialogue internally and externally. I think that's a really big one where we see different levels of engagement across the industry, and I think that's would be a very positive thing to do. Thanks.
Kia ora, Peter. Off the back of that, and this can be answered by anybody, but it is about the Fisheries Act. The Fisheries Act provides for environmental measures but fails in application to control damaging fishing methods. This is from one of our audience members. There is no effective benthic protection. And this is probably not chance, but a reflection of the power of the trawling oligarchs. How do we tackle the huge political influence of the 4 to 5 big companies and the unhealthy influence on what does and does not get researched and measures for environmental protection that are not adopted?
I'll have a first go, Elisabeth. I think first of all, look, in some ways, yes, the Fisheries Act deals with one part of the marine environment, and there's a whole range of other regulatory acts and tools and government ministries and departments that deal with other aspects of it. And that sort of segregation causes a little bit of discomfort in some areas for sure. But certainly there are benefit protected areas that are, well known and observed. So that part of things, let's say, of course, there can be a wide debate about whether they should be expanded or extended, but there are areas that are defined. That's, I guess, the first part. But certainly, I think the idea of, for the benefit of ocean management and coastal sea management, combining a lot of these different policy instruments that are distributed across government, various ministries and departments, could be certainly something to think about, and at the right time have a dialogue about.
Kia ora. And Barry, your hand went up at the beginning of that question.
Yes, thank you. Yes, and that is a big question as well, and it's got a number of facets to it. And one is that those provisions are in the Fisheries Act, and it was always intended that the Fisheries Act would be used to mitigate and remedy the environmental effects of fishing. It wouldn't require an additional act. But for one reason or another, they have never really been developed. And I think that jury's well and truly in on the damage that occurs from mobile fishing gear on the bottom to benthic habitats, and that it's pretty much accepted that there may be in places where the damage is not so great on sandy bottoms, but a lot of the area now that's been trawled, what happens is that the fine sediments are resuspended and come up into the water column and slowly settle again. And those disturbances over time really change the species assemblages on the bottom, and that has an effect on productivity. And there are lots of areas along the coast here, particularly the northeast coast, where locals could readily identify areas where there shouldn't be any bottom contact. They know that there's sort of semi-foul ground and fragile communities living there, or in a lot of cases now have been living there in the past, aren't there in the future. But there are still very strong calls up north for stronger protection on the bottom. And I think that's a very interesting question on why the Fisheries Act has not been used to further do that. And that's the short answer to it, is that the Fisheries Act, the one that we've got now, relies on what they call a rights-based system. So you give the fishing community the right to catch a certain amount of fish, and then you want to keep out of their way and let them do that how they choose, the most efficient way they can, or whatever. And that sort of that sense of entitlement and right that comes with that extractive right of fishing, that has sort of developed a lot of power in its own right, and worked against any kind of interference or intervention from government department. So I think it's a big question. I think it's up in the air, and it's way, way overdue for being addressed, being squared up to properly, and having a conversation around where it might be okay and where it may not. And for those communities who really do not want to see it out in front of their place, they should have some way of having those needs met.
Kia ora. Katherine, I saw your hand go. Oh, and Harry, I'll come to you in a second, Harry. Katherine, you had something to add.
Thanks. Kia ora koutou. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to be here, and to WWF and Doc for hosting this. And this goes to the nub of my confusion. Been home in New Zealand now for 9 years, and I spent the first 5-6 years asking questions about Section 9C of the Fisheries Act, habitats of significance, particular significance for fisheries management. Really? We haven't defined that? So my question to the panel to discuss in a bit more depth is, why has that piece of the Fisheries Act not been unpacked and implemented? And surely the RMA intervention, as you called it, Barry, in the Bay of Plenty, is actually an opportunity for coastal marine health restoration, at least with the current tools that we have.
Who would like to have a go at that?
I'll have first crack at that. Thanks, Katherine. Yes, I agree that the Bay of Plenty experience, and it's happening in the Northern Regional Council as well, it has really shone the light on this deficiency, that there are these principles within the Fisheries Act that are designed to mitigate the effects of fishing, and they have just remained virtually unused, not even acknowledged. And I'm sort of hopeful, and I think in a broader sense, that front end of the Fisheries Act is actually unfit for purpose now. And it's one of the reasons that we end up in this environment that we're in now, is that the purpose of the Act, the principles of the Act, they are not serving us, and the Part 3 are no longer fit for purpose. And it may well be that the forthcoming rewriting of the RMA that will have to, I would think, would have to occur alongside a reform of the Fisheries Act as well. It would be inconsistent to do one without the other, because there is such an overlay, as Harry says, this contiguous nature of fisheries and land. You can't really, it's illogical in my view to try and have these, keep them separate as if one is blind to the other. And I think the whole front end of the Fisheries Act is unfit for purpose now. It needs to be rewritten.
Kia ora. John, can we go, John, and then Harry will come back to you. Oh, unless Harry. Actually, Harry was next. Sorry, John, I have to be fair in here. Harry.
You'd make a good school teacher. Well done. So the bit I wanted to kind of think through is from an iwi perspective, we have fisheries allocation, and so we can be seen as part of the problem, point one. Point two is, as I was part of the Futures of Our Fisheries piece of work led out by Rob Fenwick, and what was really interesting for me is there was no trust in the room from anybody, and how they reflected that was using legislation to draw lines in the conversation. And to your point, Barry, we all recognise that the legislation is not fit for purpose, but it needs both political will and political courage to take it to the next level. Now, we've been holding the pen, I'm talking about Ngāti Kuri, been holding the pen around redrafting the Langi Tauhua Ocean Sanctuary Bill to reflect those aspirations we have from our corner. And the conversation I have in that is, from their corner, is when is the right time to go with this? Because it's highly politicised. And that's my frustration with the process. And that was why I used that last comment in my rollout, is we fundamentally can't rely on legislation to reflect our moral purposes, because it's always behind the curveball. So we've got to lead from the front. And maybe you go first, Barry, and break the law, and we'll see you in jail. Maybe that's probably the approach.
Yeah, we'll visit.
Yeah, we'll visit you.
Thank you very much.
Always. And John.
Yeah, kia ora. So I think we're looking at issues, opportunities and solutions. So I guess from a science point of view, I was just thinking that there are some opportunities here. I mean, one of the reasons that ecosystems-based management and the environmental impacts of fishing, I don't think, have been taken account, is that we don't have very good ways of actually seeing those directly. So, and this is a global problem. It's not peculiar to New Zealand. So if we could come up with means of doing that through, I know there's been a lot of progress in precision harvesting, which you could use for stock assessment, and various methods of fishing, and just in various methods of actually observing and seeing what those impacts are, then those technologies would have a global market. So I'm just saying that there are some opportunities here. If we can sort this, we may be able to generate an additional kind of commercial dimension to what's currently happening.
Got it, John. And now there's a question here that's come in that I'm really interested in. It's really massive, but it's so pertinent. Population increase is inevitable. Most presented premises seem to be ongoing back in time to when we had more marine resources for less people. We are more people for less resources. How do you deal with that conundrum without restricting access to the resources? Who wants to take that on?
Oh, I'll just have the first crack. Is that? Yeah, I'll go to jail. I think it's obvious that there is a need to restrict access to the resource, and the more demand there is for it, probably the more restrictions are required. And picking up from Harry, whether they're voluntary amongst ourselves as civilized people, or if they're in legislation, whatever. But there's a sort of an inevitability about that as more people go. I'd just like to bounce back onto what John just said about ecosystem-based management and what we might do about it. Well, I've asked quite a lot of people around the world, professional scientists, modelers about it, and one of the suggestions recommendations is that don't get too hung up on understanding all the ecosystem inputs and outputs and all the functions and how they might all be measured and ascribed and indexed and used. In the first instance, make a broad allowance for them. So instead of, we can make a model which will give us a maximum sustainable yield at a stock size of 40% of the original, for example. So that's all very well, but you're not allowing very much for ecosystem services. So what you do is you build a buffer on top of that. So you say, okay, well, let's make it 50. So if we don't reduce stocks to below 50% of their original unfished size, or their currently unfished size, we are making a huge improvement on the current state of nature. Yields will be higher. The ecosystem functions will be stronger. The food web will be far more resilient. And we don't have to be able to describe that in all this detailed way. Is that we can use that reset policy. This is what I mean by resetting policy to make things better. Not necessarily perfect. They can all be improved upon later on, but we can change policy settings quite simply and quickly to make things substantially better. To do it, we're going to have to make an investment, because we're all going to have to go and forego catch for a while to rebuild stocks. But there will be a long-term dividend for us and those who are following us, which is just unquestionable. And I'd like to see those sorts of conversations taking place, where we have some quite simple tools available to us to make a considerable long-term difference. And it's not a panacea. It doesn't fix everything or anything like that. But it's just an example of how you can make a substantial movement for the better state of nature without having to go through a lot of tortured route to get there.
Kia ora, Barry. Katherine.
Sorry, to find the unmute. Thank you, Barry. I mean, yes, New Zealand is discovering EBM now. It's been in practice around the world for a good 20 years in different contexts, and there's a lot of really good thinking going on here, which is great, well due. That forego catch point for a while, so often the finger gets pointed at the commercials, who are the ones who should forego catch. It would be really interesting to hear Moana and Harry from your own local perspectives, customary perspectives and commercial insights you may have, as well as Peter, commercial, and Barry, recreational. Would everybody be prepared to forego catch for a while in the nature of people coming together to enable that recovery, or at least the intention of recovery to occur?
From our perspective, we'd love not to fish at a commercial level. But you've got to fully understand the trickle down of that. So there's a whole lot of businesses that's sitting behind it that have certain repercussions. even better if someone paid us not to fish. Think about that model. That'll be so cool. Yeah. Then there's another component in that is as you drill down through those opportunities, we've just got to be careful about, I was going to say catastrophizing, but it's probably not the right word. Yes, we do have an opportunity to feed 40 million, and yes, we should be chasing it. I met with 30 primary sector leaders week before last, and to say if we want to do that, we need to feed our own first. So there is a moral responsibility to ourselves before we can go offshore. So how might we do that in the nexus of feeding ourselves properly as well as feeding many?
Kia ora, Harry. Moana, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, while the conversation was going, I was thinking of, I'm fortunate to have been raised by a dad who lived by the maramataka. He never said that that's what it was. So when this word started coming up, I'm thinking, oh, okay. But my dad lived by the maramataka. We took what we needed. We didn't take any more than we needed. There were always conversations in the house about what size fish was best to take and what species of fish was best to take when. And I think really if we start communicating, I don't want to say educating because that's just so, but if we start communicating with people about the why we need to do what we need to do, that might encourage and empower them to take a stand for themselves. I think in New Zealand and probably around the world, our wastage of food is just disgusting. So how much are we wasting? How much are we taking that we don't need to be taking? So if we put the onus back on ourselves as individuals and be responsible for what's happening in the environment, and I think it comes with good, clear communications. Information and knowledge is key.
Kia ora. That reminds me of a lovely story that Sue Noiroita tells of her dad when they were growing up on the Noises or having their holidays on the Noises. And if they caught too much fish, if the kids, went and just were fishing for fun, their dad would make them stay at the table until they'd finished eating the fish that they had overfished. And you don't do that more than once. I mean, even a kid's going to learn that lesson. And I think maybe if we made people eat the, fast, or Peter.
I was just going to say, Elizabeth, sort of following on a little bit from what Katherine said, that often the attention focuses towards the commercial sector here, and really, I think that conversations to date, the different commercial sector, recreational sector, customary, the positions become entrenched very, very quickly, and then the discussion sort of gets to a certain point and sort of it more or less stops. But look, the time perhaps is coming, and I think there's a lot of things that all parties in this discussion can agree on. And if we try and work to start the conversation based on what we all agree on, which is healthy oceans that can provide, a great food source, a source of livelihoods and well-being, and then sort of try and work from there before getting too quickly into these entrenched positions, pointing towards a different sector.
Absolutely. And we do have to wind up now, which is a terrible thing, but I'm going to ask one very quick question to each of you for a very off-the-cuff brief answer. We are approaching an election, and I'm going to extrapolate from one of the questions we've got here that, and I'm going to change it a little bit. What is the most important question to communicate, it says, to public and organisations and government? But I'm going to say we're all going to be knocked on the doors, if COVID allows, by politicians and rung. What is the one thing that you think, in order to enhance marine protection, people can say to that politician or that representative that you want to see happen? So if I could just go around the group from the order that I've got. Barry, what would you get somebody to say to their local politician?
I would ask them to support the New Zealand Sport Fishing Council's. Do they support the New Zealand Sport Fishing Council's fisheries reform package, Rescue Fish? And they probably have a blank look on their face and never heard of it. So start reading, brother, and tell me where you stand.
Kia ora. Moana, what would you tell a politician or ask people to share with their representative?
I'd ask a politician whether they were prepared to put the Māori before the money.
I like it. And Katherine, what would you tell your government representative?
Habitats, 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 and habitats.
Kia ora. John? Oh, John, unmute yourself. Sorry, I do that all the time too.
Yeah. No, it might be quite a long conversation, but just basing on what Moana said, I think actually putting some of the money into restoring the Māori.
Kia ora. Peter?
I would ask, what is your oceans policy? And listen to what they say or don't say, or the expression on their face, and take that as a guide.
Kia ora. And Harry, to the politician.
Yeah, deliver on the Rangitahua Ocean Sanctuary component, because that's our beacon of hope.
Kia ora. And so sad that that is all we've got time for, because we were just getting stuck into the, the nitty gritty of things. So thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today. It has been an amazing session. I have taken an awful lot away from it. We do have an evaluation survey that we are sharing a link in the chat box, and we would love for you to please copy that link into your browser, and after the closing karakia, spend a couple of minutes completing our evaluation for this webinar. This information is super useful to us, as you never know, we may decide to plan more of these webinars, and we want to make them as effective and helpful as we can. I'm so glad you could join us today. Thank you so much to our panelists, Moana, Peter, Harry, John, and Barry, and of course, thank you, Katherine. We deeply appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge, and thank you also, Katherine, for the extra incisive questions. To the behind-the-scenes team for making things run so smoothly, even when my screen goes blank. You rock. And to all of you for watching and asking such salient questions, we are very grateful. For additional queries or comments, please email marine@doc.gov.nz. And to close now, I'll hand to Moana Tamaariki-Pohe for a karakia. Kia ora.
Tēnā anō rā tātou. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa pounamu te moana, hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou I a tātou katoa. May peace be widespread, may the sea be like greenstone, a pathway for all this day. Give love, receive love, let us show respect to each other. Mauri ora.